Welcome back. What we are really seeing over the past few weeks is not a move towards stability, but a sudden acceleration of contradictions. Publicly, leaders are talking about peace frameworks, negotiations, and endgames. Privately, almost every major actor is taking steps that make a negotiated settlement harder, not easier. That disconnect is not accidental. It reflects a deeper shift in incentives as the war in Ukraine moves from a question of military outcomes to one of political survival, legal liability, and blame management. The speed of recent developments has created the illusion of momentum, but when you slow it down and examine the logic, what emerges is a highly unstable situation in which each side is preparing not for peace, but for the moment when peace fails. Let me frame this through one central analytical lens. Imagine this as an unscripted conversation with an expert who is not reacting to headlines, but trying to understand incentives. The key question is not who wants peace, because almost everyone claims to. The real question is under what conditions does peace become politically survivable for those in power? When you approach it this way, many of the apparent absurdities suddenly make sense. Proposals that look irrational from a diplomatic standpoint become very rational from a domestic political one. What we are really seeing here is the collision of three timelines. The first is the military timeline, where the balance on the battlefield has slowly but decisively shifted in Russia's favor. The second is the economic timeline, where Ukraine's financial sustainability is increasingly dependent on extraordinary measures by external actors. The third is the political timeline, especially in the United States and Europe, where leaders are approaching election, leadership transitions, or institutional crises. These timelines do not align, and that misalignment is driving behavior that looks chaotic on the surface. Now consider the peace proposals that have recently circulated. On paper, they are framed as compromises. In reality, the terms being discussed guarantee rejection by Moscow. This is not a matter of misunderstanding or cultural difference. These proposals reintroduce, almost point for point, the conditions that Russia identified as existential threats before the war began: a heavily armed Ukraine, integrated into Western security structures, protected by external guarantees, and financed indefinitely by Western institutions. Asking Russia to accept such an outcome after years of war is not diplomacy. It is positioning. This is not accidental. There is a deeper political struggle underway, particularly in Washington. The United States is not operating as a single coherent actor. There are competing centers of power: the executive branch, Congress, the security bureaucracy, and allied networks embedded in transatlantic institutions. Any serious peace deal would require concessions that would immediately be weaponized in domestic politics. No administration wants to be accused of losing Ukraine, especially when that accusation could shape midterm elections, budget battles, or leadership legitimacy. So instead, we see a familiar pattern. Proposals are advanced that are publicly framed as reasonable, but privately understood to be unacceptable. When rejection comes, responsibility can be shifted. This is how blame is prepared in advance. If Russia rejects the terms, it can be portrayed as the sole obstacle to peace. If Ukraine collapses financially or militarily later, the narrative is already written: everything was offered. The other side refused. Europe, meanwhile, is facing its own version of this dilemma. The European Union is not a state, it is a layered system of institutions with limited democratic insulation. Many of its leaders are not thinking in terms of long-term continental security, but in terms of short-term political survival within a very narrow corridor of acceptable opinion. This is where institutional failure becomes visible. Decision-making shifts from parliaments to emergency mechanisms, from law to exception, from accountability to urgency. Legal order is not abandoned in one dramatic move, it is hollowed out incrementally. Take the debate over frozen Russian assets. Freezing assets during a conflict is one thing. Confiscating them, repurposing them, or using them as collateral for long-term financing is something else entirely. The legal distinction matters because it defines whether international financial norms still exist. What we are seeing is an attempt to blur that line without openly admitting the consequences. Some European states are increasingly uncomfortable with this, not out of sympathy for Russia, but out of concern for precedent. If data sets can be effectively expropriated through political coordination, then no reserve is truly safe. This brings us to the economic dimension. Ukraine's war effort is no longer just a military project, it is a financial construction held together by guarantees, rollovers, and political promises. The sustainability of this model depends on constant escalation of commitment. Each new tranche of funding makes withdrawal harder. Each legal shortcut increases systemic risk. At some point, the question stops being can we help Ukraine win and becomes can we afford the consequences of admitting that this model has failed. What we are really seeing here is that Europe is trapped between two fears. The first is the fear of defeat, the political, moral, and reputational cost of acknowledging that years of policy have not produced the desired outcome. The second is the fear of escalation, the recognition that pushing further risks direct confrontation without the material capacity to sustain it. European militaries are depleted, industrial bases are strained, and public tolerance for austerity is thin. This is why the rhetoric is maximalist while the actions remain cautious. It is a dangerous imbalance. On the Russian side, the situation is often misunderstood in the West. There is a tendency to view decision-making as purely centralized, as if one individual dictates every move. In reality, pressure is building within the Russian system as well. Expectations were raised that diplomatic engagement with Washington might produce a framework that acknowledged core security concerns. As those expectations collapse, the argument for restraint weakens. When diplomacy appears performative rather than substantive, escalation becomes easier to justify internally. This is where the military dimension re-enters the picture. Russia still retains significant escalation options that fall short of total war. These include actions designed to disrupt intelligence flows, logistics, and external support without crossing formal alliance thresholds. Such moves would not be about territorial gains alone, but about signaling. They would communicate that certain forms of indirect involvement carry costs. The risk, of course, is miscalculation. Escalation ladders are rarely as controllable as policymakers imagine. What makes the current moment particularly unstable is that several actors appear to believe escalation can be managed because the other side cannot afford to respond. This is a dangerous assumption. History shows that wars often expand not because someone wants a wider conflict, but because credibility, domestic politics, or alliance commitments narrow the range of acceptable responses. When leaders publicly define red lines they cannot enforce, they create incentives for testing. Now let's return to the peace process itself, or what is labeled as such. The absence of direct engagement with Russia in many of these discussions is not a procedural oversight, it is a feature. Negotiations without all principal parties are not negotiations. They are signaling exercises. They are designed to shape narratives, not outcomes. This allows leaders to claim diplomatic effort while avoiding the political cost of compromise. The public narrative emphasizes unity, values, and resolve. But behind the scenes reality is fragmentation, legal improvisation, and strategic ambiguity. These two layers cannot coexist indefinitely. At some point, material constraints assert themselves. Budgets run out. Legal challenges accumulate. Political coalitions fracture. When that happens, decisions that were postponed under the banner of solidarity suddenly become unavoidable. The forward-looking question, then, is not whether the current approach is sustainable, but how its collapse will be managed. One plausible scenario is a gradual financial implosion of Ukraine's state capacity, followed by internal political upheaval. Another is a sharp escalation designed to force negotiations under worse conditions. A third is a prolonged limbo, where neither peace nor decisive victory emerges, but systemic risks multiply. In all of these scenarios, the role of blame will be central. Every major actor is already positioning for that moment. Documents are drafted, statements are recorded, narratives are rehearsed. This is why so much of what we hear sounds disconnected from reality. It is not meant to persuade adversaries, it is meant to preempt future accusations. So where does this leave us? Realistically, the path ahead is narrow and uncomfortable. A durable settlement would require acknowledging limits to military solutions, limits to economic endurance, and limits to narrative control. It would require compromises that no one wants to explain to their domestic audience. That is why it remains unlikely in the short term. The more probable outcome is a continuation of strategic drift punctuated by sharp crises. Escalation risks will rise, not because of deliberate intent to provoke a larger war, but because the mechanisms designed to prevent it are being eroded. Legal norms, institutional checks, and diplomatic channels are all under strain. When those buffers weaken, accidents matter more. This is why optimism is difficult to justify, even if outright catastrophe is not inevitable. This system is not sleepwalking blindly, but it is moving forward with its eyes fixed on domestic political horizons rather than on long-term stability. That is a recipe for misjudgment. The audience should not expect reassurance from this analysis, because reassurance would be misleading. What we should expect instead is a period where outcomes are shaped less by strategy than by the management of failure, and where the costs of avoiding hard decisions today are paid with interest tomorrow.